The first thing Miss Elspeth Rowan noticed that morning was the sound. Not the church bell that usually marked the hour with a soft, reliable certainty, but a sharper noise, voices, overlapping and urgent, as if the village itself had been startled awake. Kilmore by the Brae was not a place that raised its voice without reason. Even the wind came through politely, as if mindful of the stone cottages and the old people inside them. Elspeth stood at her kitchen window with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone lukewarm. The lane beyond her gate, normally empty but for the postman's van or a dog being walked at an unhurried pace, now held a small knot of people near the notice board. Someone had dropped a basket. Apples lay scattered like bright little signals on the grey road. A moment later, her door rattled with a knock that didn't wait for permission. "Miss Rowan," came the breathless voice of Morag Flett from next door, already pushing the words through the gap before Elspeth could properly open it. Morag's cheeks were pink with cold and excitement, and her wool scarf sat crooked as if she'd thrown it on while running. "You'll no believe it. It's Agnes." Elspeth's face stayed mild, almost blank, the way a pond looks when it's deep. "Agnes MacLeod?" she asked, though there was only one Agnes that could cause Morag to forget manners. "Aye, dead." Morag's eyes shone with a complicated mixture of shock and satisfaction, as if she couldn't decide whether she wanted to cry or tell everyone first. "In the market hall. They've got the doors shut and—" She leaned in, as if the air itself might listen. It wasn't natural. Elspeth felt something tighten. Not fear exactly, but a weary recognition. Agnes MacLeod had been the village's loudest certainty. Brisk steps, sharper tongue, and a gift for appearing precisely where she wasn't wanted. She owned the kind of knowledge that didn't come from books, who was in debt, who drank too much, who had visitors from the city and pretended it was for business. Agnes called it keeping an eye out. Everyone else called it gossip except when they were quietly relieved she had noticed something they had missed. "Elspeth," Morag said again, eager for a reaction. "Come on. They're saying the police are coming from Inverness." Elspeth set her mug down and reached for her coat. "If the doors are shut, we'll not be any help pressing our noses to them," she said calmly. Morag's mouth opened, then closed. "Still," she insisted, "folk are saying all sorts." "That's what folk do," Elspeth replied, and stepped outside. The air smelled of peat smoke and damp stone. Christmas had come and gone only days ago, leaving behind scraps of tinsel in windows and a tired-looking wreath still hanging on the market hall door across the green. The village's festive cheer had thinned into something brittle, like frost on a puddle. Elspeth walked beside Morag without hurry. Hurry made people careless, and careless people stepped on clues. They found the crowd gathered at a respectful distance from the market hall, though a respectful in Kilmuir often meant near enough to hear. The hall was an old building, its stonework darkened by years of rain. A banner still hung from last week's holiday fair, slightly crooked now, as if embarrassed to be associated with what had happened inside. At the front of the crowd stood Constable Jamie Sutherland, looking as though he'd been given a task meant for someone older and tougher. He had broad shoulders under his uniform, but his face still carried the open look of a boy who hadn't yet learned how heavy secrets could be. "Back now," Jamie was saying, trying to sound firm. "There's no to see. Go home. Let folk work." "We are folk," someone muttered. Elspeth caught Jamie's eye as she approached. His relief was quick and involuntary, like a candle flaring. He knew her, as everyone did. She wasn't important exactly, not in the official way, but she had a steadiness that made people feel they could hand her their worries without them breaking. "Miss Rowan," he said, lowering his voice, "I'd ask you to go back." "Of course," Elspeth said gently. "Have you told Agnes's family?" His jaw shifted. "Her niece, Fiona. She's inside with Mrs. Grant from the council. I've sent for the doctor and the detectives are on the road." Elspeth glanced at the hall door. A thin line of light showed at the bottom, and for some reason that ordinary detail made the whole thing feel sharper, more real. "How was she found?" she asked, as casually as if inquiring after the weather. Jamie hesitated, then answered in a tone that suggested he hadn't meant to. "In the back room, where they keep the cash box after market days. Mrs. Kerr found her when she came to set up the tea urn." Morag inhaled dramatically. "In the cash room," she whispered, already building a story in her mind. Elspeth ignored Morag and watched Jamie. "And you said it wasn't natural." Jamie's eyes flicked away. "Doctor hasn't said anything yet," he corrected quickly, then added quieter. "But there was something." I'd rather not talk about it out here. Elspeth nodded as if she accepted that completely, though she stored the slip away with care. People revealed more than they intended when they were frightened, and Jamie was frightened. Not of blood. He'd be trained for that, but of what a death did to a small place. It made everyone look at each other differently. She turned her attention to the crowd. Already names were being tossed like stones. Agnes's old rival from the craft stall, the man whose parking fines she'd reported, the young couple she'd accused of living in sin, though Elspeth suspected they were simply living in peace. Agnes had a talent for making enemies without ever raising her voice. She did it by smiling. Agnes knew too much, Morag murmured beside Elspeth. That's what I always said. People don't like it when you tell the truth. Elspeth's gaze drifted to the pub across the green. The windows were dark, but she could imagine the landlord, Callum Ray, already preparing to host a day of hushed conversations. The pub was where stories went to be sharpened. Then she saw him, Angus Doyle, standing slightly apart from the rest, as if he'd tried to leave and found his feet wouldn't cooperate. Angus was the village postman, and he carried himself with the carefulness of a man always balancing something fragile. He stared at the market hall door with a fixed, stunned expression. Elspeth stepped toward him. "Angus," she said softly, "are you all right?" He blinked like someone surfacing from deep water. I didn't mean..." He stopped, swallowed hard. "I came early, like always. Dropped off the bundles for the stalls. Agnes was already there. She was in a temper, like always." "What about?" Elspeth asked, keeping her voice light. Angus rubbed his palm over his mouth. "She said someone was lying to the village. She said she had proof. Said she'd be doing folk a favour by telling them." Morag leaned closer, hungry for details, but Elspeth stayed calm. "Did she say who?" Angus shook his head too quickly. "No, just, she kept saying, they'll not wriggle out of it this time, like she was pleased, like she was holding something sharp behind her back." Elspeth's mind arranged the words carefully. Proof. A lie. Not wriggling out. Agnes had gone beyond ordinary gossip. She'd found something that made her feel powerful. "And then?" Elspeth asked. Angus looked down at his boots. "Then Fiona came in. Agnes told her to wait outside. They argued quietly, but..." He flinched as if the memory had teeth. "Agnes said something about Fiona's mother. Something cruel. Fiona went white as paper and walked out." Elspeth noticed Jamie watching them now, tense and uncertain. Elspeth gave him a small, reassuring nod, as if to say she wasn't causing trouble, only collecting what would otherwise be lost. "After Fiona left," Angus continued, "Agnes went to the back room with her handbag. She told me to mind my own business." He let out a short, helpless laugh, as if I ever did anything else. "And you left," Elspeth said. I went on my route." His eyes lifted, wet and ashamed. "If I'd stayed, Elspeth touched his sleeve lightly. "If you had stayed, Angus, you might have been the one to find her sooner, or you might have been the one in danger. There's no comfort in that kind of thinking." Morag shifted, restless. "So, it was Fiona," she whispered, almost pleased to have a target. Elspeth's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in thought. "It could be many things," she said quietly, and Morag fell silent at the tone. Elspeth looked again at the market hall door, at the thin line of light beneath it, and felt the village's familiar shape changing. Whatever Agnes had found, whatever secret she'd planned to turn into a spectacle, had not stayed safely in her handbag. It had spilled out into Kilmuir by the Bray, and now it sat between the cottages like a cold stone no one wanted to pick up. Behind the closed door, Fiona would be trying to breathe. Jamie would be trying to be brave. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between what people said and what they meant, the truth would be waiting, patient, like winter, until someone was careful enough to see it. Elspeth did not go home. She let Morag drift back into the crowd to feed and be fed by speculation, and she walked instead toward the side lane that ran behind the market hall. The village green was still buzzing with voices, but the lane was quieter, bordered by a dry stone wall and a row of bare hawthorns whose branches looked like dark handwriting against the pale sky. The air had that Scottish winter sharpness that seemed to clean the inside of your lungs. At the rear of the hall, a small service door stood guarded by Constable Sutherland, who looked up as she approached and, for a second, seemed uncertain whether to stop her or confide in her. He chose the middle path, which was to block the way while not quite meeting her eyes. "Miss Rowan," he said again, sounding apologetic this time, "truly you should go." "I'm only walking," Elspeth replied mildly. "I've no intention of pushing past you." Jamie's shoulders eased a fraction. "They're near here," he said, meaning the detectives. "Could be any minute." "Then you'll want the lane clear," Elspeth agreed. "Is Fiona still inside?" Jamie's gaze flicked to the door as if he could see through stone. She's not taking it well." "Who would?" Elspeth said. And then, because it was the sort of thing a village constable noticed even if he tried not to, she asked, "Has anyone left by this door since you arrived?" Jamie hesitated, then answered reluctantly, "No, not from inside, but—" He caught himself, jaw tightening, as if he'd stepped too close to the edge of what he was allowed to say. "But someone came to the door," Elspeth offered gently, giving him a safe place to put the words. Jamie exhaled through his nose. "Callum Ray, from the pub. He came round wanting to know if the market would open later. Said he had deliveries coming. I told him to go." "And did he?" Elspeth asked. Jamie's mouth twitched. "He went, eventually." Elspeth nodded as if discussing bread prices. Callum Ray never did anything without a reason, and he never asked a question he didn't already suspect the answer to. If he'd come to the back, it was because he didn't want to be seen with the crowd at the front. That alone was interesting. A car engine sounded in the distance, then nearer, tyres on wet road, and Elspeth watched Jamie straighten, like a young tree bracing for a storm. Two vehicles rolled into the green and stopped. The first was a plain police car. The second, an unmarked dark estate that looked as though it had driven all night. Doors opened. The crowd surged, then checked itself like a wave hitting rock. Elspeth remained in the lane, out of the spectacle, and waited. The detectives arrived with the quiet authority of people who had learned not to waste movement. The woman came first, tall, solid in a dark coat, hair pinned back with severe practicality. The man followed, older, greying, his expression folded into a permanent look of disappointment, as if the world had repeatedly failed to meet basic standards. Jamie hurried to meet them at the corner of the hall, speaking fast. The woman listened, eyes moving constantly. The crowd, the doors, the windows, the way people stood too close together. She took in the village the way a seamstress took in a piece of cloth, measuring where it would tear. Elspeth did not need to hear the names to understand the roles. The woman was the one who would do the work. The man was the one who would be suspicious of everyone doing it. After a moment, the woman detective separated from her colleague and walked around the side toward the lane, likely intending to assess the back entrance. Jamie spotted Elspeth and made a small, helpless gesture, but it was too late to pretend she wasn't there. The detective's gaze landed on Elspeth, cool and direct. "You live nearby?" the detective said, not asking. Elspeth offered a small smile. "Across the lane, yes. And you're here because a death in a small place is never only one person's business," Elspeth said simply. "And because young Constable Sutherland is trying to do three people's work with one pair of hands." The detective's mouth did not soften, but something in her eyes shifted. Recognition, perhaps, of a village type she'd encountered before. The quiet woman who seemed harmless until you realised she knew everyone's habits and histories. "I'm Detective Inspector Fraser," she said. "And you are?" "Elspeth Rowan." Fraser's glance moved over Elspeth's coat, her sensible shoes, the calm steadiness that suggested she wasn't here for drama. "Have you been inside?" "No." "Have you touched anything? Moved anything?" "No." "Good." Fraser stepped past her toward the back door, then paused. "You were speaking to the constable. What did he tell you?" "He told me the doctor has not yet made any official statement," Elspeth replied, careful with each word, "and that Mrs. Kerr found Agnes MacLeod in the back room when she came to set up for the day." Fraser's attention sharpened. "Did he say anything about the condition of the body?" "He did not," Elspeth said, "only that it didn't look natural." Fraser's eyes flicked briefly toward Jamie, who looked as if he wished he could crawl into the stone wall. "And you heard that from him?" "I inferred it from his choice of words," Elspeth said pleasantly, which was a kinder version of the truth. Fraser opened the back door with a gloved hand and slipped inside. The smell that drifted out was faint but unmistakable. Stale tea, old timber, and something metallic beneath it that winter air could not hide. Elspeth remained in the lane, but through the crack she saw movement. Gloved hands, a flashlight beam, the precise choreography of people who did not want to disturb what had been left behind. After several minutes, Fraser stepped back out and closed the door, her face giving nothing away. "Is Fiona MacLeod her niece?" Elspeth asked quietly. "Aye," Fraser said, then corrected herself with a faint edge of professionalism. "Yes, Fiona MacLeod is next of kin on file. She was here early." "Arguing with Agnes," Elspeth said softly, letting it sit on the air like a question. Fraser's gaze snapped back to Elspeth. "Who told you that?" "The postman," Elspeth replied. "Angus Doyle. He was delivering stall bundles. He said Fiona came in, was told to wait outside, and there was an argument. He said Agnes mentioned Fiona's mother." Fraser's eyes narrowed. "He told you that?" "He's upset," Elspeth said. "And he's the sort of man who tells the truth when he's upset, because it's the only thing he can hold on to." Fraser studied her for a long moment, weighing whether Elspeth was a nuisance or a resource. "Don't speak to witnesses," she said finally. "Not about this." "I haven't asked anyone to accuse anyone," Elspeth replied. "I've only listened." Fraser didn't respond to that. She looked down the lane toward the green. Agnes MacLeod had enemies? Elspeth gave a small shrug. Agnes had a talent for collecting them. She also had a talent for collecting information. Fraser's voice went flatter. "Information about what?" Elspeth's gaze drifted to the hawthorn branches. "That depends who you ask. Money, affairs, arguments, old stories people wanted buried. Agnes didn't care what it was, as long as it was sharp enough to use." Fraser's phone buzzed. She looked at it, then pocketed it. "Forensics are on their way. Doctor too. Until then, this is a contained scene." "You've closed both doors," Elspeth observed. Fraser's eyes flicked to her again. "Did you notice something?" Elspeth never said yes too quickly. She tilted her head. "Only that if Agnes wanted privacy, she'd use the back room. If someone else wanted privacy with Agnes, they'd use the back room too. And if someone wanted to leave without being seen by the crowd, this lane is the easiest path." Fraser didn't argue. She scanned the ground, wet gravel, a thin line of slush at the wall's base, footprints half smudged by earlier traffic. "You said she collected information," Fraser said. "Did she share it?" "Not for free," Elspeth replied. A sound came from inside the hall then, muffled crying, and a woman's voice trying to calm it. Fraser's jaw tightened. "I need to speak to Fiona," she said, and started toward the front again. Elspeth walked with her, not beside, but a pace behind, close enough to hear, far enough to not feel intrusive. The green looked different now. The crowd had been pushed back farther, held at bay by the older detective and a second uniformed officer who had arrived with the team. People still craned and whispered, but the easy excitement had been replaced by a nervousness that made the air prickle. Inside the market hall, the warmth hit Elspeth first. Old radiators, lingering scent of baked goods from holiday stalls, the ghost of cinnamon and sugar clinging to timber. Chairs were stacked at one end. At the other, in a small side room near the kitchen, Fiona sat hunched on a folding chair, face blotched, eyes swollen. She looked younger than Elspeth expected, as if grief had stripped away whatever age she carried. Beside her stood Mrs. Grant, the council clerk, hovering like a stiff umbrella. Fiona lifted her head when Fraser entered, and something hard flashed through the grief, fear and anger, and a kind of trapped defiance. "I didn't do it," Fiona said before anyone asked a question. Fraser didn't react. "No one has accused you," she said evenly. "But you were here this morning. I need you to tell me exactly what happened." Fiona's hands clenched around a tissue. "I came to help set up," she said, voice shaking, "because Agnes, my aunt, she insisted. She always insisted. I told her I was done with the market, done with her, but she said she had something to tell me, something about my mum." Elspeth watched Fiona's eyes dart to the door, to the corners, as if the room itself might betray her. This was not only grief for Agnes, this was dread of what Agnes had been about to reveal. Fraser leaned forward slightly. "What did she say?" Fiona swallowed. She said Mum wasn't who I thought she was. She said Mum had lied, and that I'd been living off a lie my whole life." Her voice cracked. "She said she had proof in her bag, that she'd show everyone today if I didn't listen." "And did you listen?" Fraser asked. Fiona's breath hitched. "I told her she was a cruel old woman," she whispered. "I told her I hated her." Elspeth felt the room tighten around that word. Hate sounded dramatic, but in a village it could become evidence. Fraser's tone stayed level. Then what? Fiona wiped her face. Then I left. I went outside because I couldn't... She pressed the tissue to her mouth, fighting nausea. I stood by the notice board. I was trying to breathe. I saw Angus leaving with his bag. I saw Mrs. Kerr come up the front steps, and then I heard Mrs. Kerr scream. Fraser held Fiona's gaze. Did you see anyone go to the back door? Fiona shook her head quickly. No, I swear, I didn't. Elspeth's eyes moved, almost idly, to Fiona's coat draped over the chair back. Something dark clung to the cuff. Mud, perhaps, or soot. It might mean nothing. It might mean a great deal. Elspeth did not stare long enough for anyone to notice she had noticed. Fraser stood up. All right, she said. Stay here. Don't leave the hall. Fiona's eyes filled again. She was horrible, she whispered, as if that should matter more. But she was still my aunt. Elspeth understood that sort of grief. It was heavier because it came mixed with other things. As Fraser moved to the doorway, the older detective passed by, speaking low. Elspeth caught only fragments. Doctor arrived. Something on the body, something found in the handbag. Fraser's face hardened, the way iron cooled into its final shape. She glanced back at Fiona one last time, then at Elspeth, as if remembering she existed. Miss Rowan, Fraser said, voice quiet but firm, go home. Elspeth nodded politely and began to walk out into the cold again, carrying the weight of what she had heard like a careful parcel. Agnes had threatened a public reveal. She had proof in her handbag. Someone had ensured she never reached the front of the hall to speak, and in Kilmuir by the Bray, where everyone knew everyone's name, a secret big enough to kill for was almost never a stranger's. Elspeth went home, but she did not settle. Her cottage greeted her with its familiar quiet, the ticking clock on the mantel, the faint smell of lavender polish, the kettle still half full on the stove. Normally, these small certainties steadied her. Today they felt like a thin blanket laid over something restless underneath. She removed her coat carefully, as if noise itself might disturb the thoughts arranging themselves in her mind. Agnes's handbag. Proof. A threat made too loudly, too confidently, in a place where walls had ears and grudges long memories. Elspeth poured herself fresh tea and sat at the small table by the window. From here she could see part of the lane and beyond it the edge of the green. The crowd had thinned, but people still lingered in twos and threes, reluctant to return to normal when normal had so clearly cracked. A police officer stood where the notice board had been, posture rigid, eyes scanning. Containment, Fraser had called it. Kilmuir would not appreciate that word, but it would submit to it for now. Elspeth lifted her cup, then paused. Across the lane, a door opened and closed again quickly. Callum Ray stepped out from behind the pub, collar turned up, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He did not head toward the green. Instead, he glanced once toward the market hall and then walked briskly in the opposite direction, toward the cottages by the river. That was not the way a man went if he was curious. It was the way a man went if he was avoiding being seen. Elspeth watched until he disappeared from view. Then she drank her tea. Agnes MacLeod had known things. That alone was not remarkable. The village survived on a shared illusion of transparency, but everyone kept something back. What made Agnes dangerous was her appetite for leverage. She didn't trade in truth, she traded in exposure. Elspeth rose, collected her scarf and stepped outside again. If she stayed indoors, her thoughts would turn in on themselves. Walking gave them shape. She did not head toward the green. Instead, she took the longer path toward the river cottages, where the ground dipped and the air smelled of wet earth and iron-rich water. The path was narrow and uneven, but Elspeth had walked it often enough to know where to place her feet without looking. She found Callum standing outside Mrs. Ainsley's cottage, rapping on the door with a sharp impatience that didn't suit his usual easy manner. Mrs. Ainsley was the village archivist, unofficial but thorough, keeper of baptism records, old council minutes, faded photographs that no one else remembered the names in. Agnes had visited her more than once, always leaving with a tight smile. Elspeth slowed, letting her presence announce itself with the soft crunch of gravel. Callum turned. Surprise crossed his face, followed quickly by calculation. "Miss Rowan," he said, forcing a smile. Out for a stroll? Yes, Elspeth replied. And you? He gestured vaguely. Just checking on Mrs. Ainsley, making sure she's all right with everything that's happened. Elspeth's eyes flicked to the closed door. How thoughtful. Callum cleared his throat. People are upset. Agnes had a way of unsettling folk. She did, Elspeth agreed, especially when she believed she had proof of something. Callum's smile faltered, only slightly. Proof? Elspeth met his gaze steadily. She told her niece she had something to reveal, something she planned to make public today. Callum's eyes dropped to the ground, then lifted again, sharper. Agnes liked to exaggerate. She liked to be believed, Elspeth said, and she liked to be safe. Threats are only useful if you think you'll survive making them. Callum shifted his weight. I should be going, he said too quickly. Deliveries. Of course, Elspeth replied, stepping aside to give him room. He hesitated, then moved past her, brushing close enough that she caught the scent of tobacco and soap. As he walked away, his shoulders were stiff, his pace uneven. A man leaving behind something unresolved. Elspeth waited until he was out of sight, then turned her attention to Mrs. Ainsley's door. She knocked, gently. It took a moment, but the door opened a crack. Mrs. Ainsley peered out, her thin face lined with worry. Oh, Elspeth, I wasn't expecting... I won't stay, Elspeth said. I only wanted to see how you were. Mrs. Ainsley's eyes darted toward the path Callum had taken. People are asking questions, she murmured. Questions I can't answer. Agnes asked questions too, Elspeth said softly. Mrs. Ainsley sighed and opened the door wider, just enough to allow Elspeth inside. The cottage smelled of dust and old paper. Stacks of folders lined the walls, each carefully labelled in Mrs. Ainsley's precise hand. She came last week, Mrs. Ainsley said without prompting. Agnes wanted to see old records, births, deaths, marriages, things that should have stayed settled. And did you show her? Elspeth asked. I did, Mrs. Ainsley admitted, eyes downcast, because they're public records, and because she already knew where to look. She always did. Elspeth nodded. What was she interested in? Mrs. Ainsley hesitated, then walked to a small cabinet and rested her hand on it, as if drawing strength. Fiona's mother, she said. Mary MacLeod, or Mary Fraser, as she was before she married Agnes's brother. Elspeth felt the name settle into place. There was something unusual. Mrs. Ainsley let out a thin breath. Mary gave birth in Inverness, not here. The father's name on the record was left blank at first. It was added later. Different ink, different hand. Added by whom? Elspeth asked. Mrs. Ainsley shook her head. I can't say for certain, but Agnes believed it was added to protect someone with influence. Elspeth's thoughts moved quickly now, threading connections. Influence in a village often meant money, or respectability, or both. Did Agnes take copies? Elspeth asked. Yes, Mrs. Ainsley said. She insisted, said she'd earned the right. Elspeth thanked her and left, her mind heavy but clearer. Agnes had not just been gossiping, she had been digging, and she had found something that threatened the careful shape of someone's life. As Elspeth walked back toward the green, she noticed the way people fell silent as she passed. Word moved faster than reason in Kilmuir. Already, lines were being drawn, stories bending toward comfort rather than truth. Near the market hall she saw Fiona again, this time through a side window. Fiona sat alone now, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. The dark mark on her coat cuff was still there. Mud, perhaps, or ash. The lane by the back door was gritty with both. Elspeth did not stop. She kept walking, letting the pieces settle. Agnes had threatened to reveal a lie about Fiona's mother. She had proof in her handbag. Someone had confronted her in the back room away from the crowd. Someone who knew exactly what would be lost if that proof became public. In a village like Kilmuir by the Bray, where reputations were inherited as carefully as cottages, the past was never really past. It waited, patient and sharp, for someone foolish enough, or brave enough, to drag it into the light. And Agnes MacLeod had done exactly that. By evening the cold had settled into the village like a second skin. Lights glowed behind curtains, warmer and brighter than usual, as if everyone were trying to convince themselves that nothing had truly changed. Elspeth moved through her cottage with quiet purpose, setting a pot of soup to warm, folding a blanket she did not need. Activity kept her thoughts from circling too tightly. Agnes's threat echoed in her mind, not the words themselves, but the confidence behind them. Agnes had believed she was protected by the very thing that made her dangerous. People who knew secrets often mistook knowledge for safety. A knock sounded at the door, hesitant, then firmer. Elspeth paused only a moment before answering. It was Jamie Sutherland, cap tucked under his arm, his face drawn with the strain of a day that had stretched far beyond his experience. "Sorry to trouble you," he said, though his eyes suggested relief at being there. "Inspector Fraser asked me to check in. Make sure you weren't involved." Elspeth smiled faintly. "Involved in what exactly?" Jamie flushed. "She didn't say, just," he gestured helplessly, "you were around, asking questions." "I've lived here 40 years, Elspeth replied. "That alone makes me suspicious." That coaxed a reluctant smile from him. He stepped inside, stamping cold from his boots. "They found something," he said quietly, unable to keep it in. "In Agnes's handbag." Elspeth waited. "A bundle of papers," Jamie continued. "Copies of records, birth records, and a letter. Old. Not addressed, but signed." "Signed by whom?" Elspeth asked. Jamie shook his head. "Inspector Fraser hasn't said. Only that it changes things." "Everything changes things," Elspeth said. "It's only a question of how much." Jamie leaned against the doorframe, clearly torn between duty and the need to speak. "The doctor says Agnes didn't die of natural causes. Poison, likely. Something mixed into her tea." Elspeth closed her eyes briefly. Tea was intimate. Tea required time, proximity, familiarity. So whoever it was didn't rush. "No," Jamie said. "They stayed." Elspeth opened her eyes. "Has the pub been asked about supplies, cleaning agents, anything that might be used?" Jamie nodded. "Callum Ray's being cooperative. Too cooperative, if you ask me." Elspeth said nothing. Cooperation often came from confidence, or calculation. "And Fiona?" Elspeth asked. Jamie's shoulders sagged. "She's a mess. Says she left before anything happened. Says she never went near the back door." "People tell the truth they can live with," Elspeth said gently. Jamie straightened. "Inspector Fraser asked me to tell you to keep to yourself." "I will," Elspeth replied, "as long as that doesn't mean pretending I don't see what's in front of me." Jamie hesitated, then nodded. He put his cap back on, pausing at the threshold. "If you remember anything," he said, voice low, "anything at all." "I'll let you know," Elspeth promised. After he left, the cottage felt quieter than before. Elspeth sat at the table, soup forgotten, and considered what poison meant. Poison required planning. It required access. It required a reason strong enough to risk discovery. She thought of Mrs. Kerr, who had found the body, of Angus, who had left Agnes alone with her secrets, of Callum, hovering at the edges, and of Fiona, whose life had been built on something Agnes claimed was a lie. The knock came again, sharper this time. Fiona stood on the step, eyes red, face pale with exhaustion rather than tears. Her coat was pulled tight around her, the cuff still stained. Elspeth stepped aside without a word and let her in. "I didn't know where else to go," Fiona said, voice flat. "Everyone's looking at me like I've already been judged." Elspeth poured tea, habitual, grounding, and set the cup in Fiona's trembling hands. "Sit," she said. "You're safe here." Fiona stared into the cup as if it might answer her questions. "They found the papers," she said. "Agnes's papers." Elspeth nodded. "So I hear." "They asked me about my mum," Fiona continued, "about her past. Things I don't understand." Her voice broke then, anger cutting through grief. "Why would she do that to me? Why now?" "Because secrets rot when they're kept too long," Elspeth said, "and rot makes some people reckless." Fiona looked up sharply. "You believe her, don't you? You believe my mum lied?" "I believe Agnes found something," Elspeth replied carefully. "That doesn't always mean what she thought it meant." Fiona's breath shuddered. "They think I poisoned her." Elspeth met her gaze steadily. "Did you?" "No," Fiona said too quickly, then steadied herself. "No, I didn't. I was angry, yes. I said terrible things, but I left. I went outside. I swear it." "Did you go anywhere else?" Elspeth asked. Fiona hesitated, just a fraction. "I walked down the lane," she admitted. "By the back. I needed air." "And the mark on your coat?" Elspeth asked softly. Fiona looked down, then away. "I leaned against the wall. It was filthy." Elspeth let that settle. Did you see anyone? Fiona shook her head. No, but I heard voices, muffled. Agnes arguing with someone. I couldn't make out the words. Elspeth's pulse quickened, though her face remained calm. Did you tell the police that? They didn't ask, Fiona said bitterly. They only asked what I said to her. What? She said to me. Elspeth reached across the table, resting her hand lightly over Fiona's. You should tell them, she said. Soon. Fiona pulled her hand back. And make myself look worse. Truth rarely makes things worse, Elspeth said. Only silence does. Fiona stood abruptly, pacing the small room. Agnes said my mother ruined someone, she said. That she was protected. That everyone else paid the price. Elspeth thought of Mrs. Ainsley's cabinet, of altered ink, of influence. Did your mother ever speak of her life before the village? Fiona laughed hollowly. No, she avoided it. Said it didn't matter. And does it? Elspeth asked. Fiona stopped pacing. It does now. When Fiona left, night had fully claimed the village. Elspeth watched her walk away, a solitary figure swallowed by darkness and suspicion. Elspeth extinguished the lamps one by one and stood at the window. Somewhere beyond the cottages the river moved steadily on, indifferent to secrets and deaths alike. Agnes MacLeod had believed she could control the story by threatening to tell it. She had underestimated the desperation of those who needed it buried. And now, with poison in a teacup and lies pulled from dusty drawers, Kilmuir by the Bray was no longer merely watching a mystery unfold. It was living inside it. Sleep did not come easily to Elspeth that night. When it did arrive, it was thin and fractured, filled with the sound of cups touching saucers and voices murmuring just beyond comprehension. She woke before dawn. The darkness pressed close against the windows and lay still until the ticking of the clock steadied her breathing. By the time the first grey light crept over the hills, she was already dressed. The village felt altered in the early morning, as if it were holding its breath. Frost glazed the road, and each step rang too loudly on the frozen ground. Elspeth moved carefully, aware that even routine gestures now carried weight. People noticed things differently after a death. They remembered where you had been, how you had spoken, whether you had looked surprised enough. She did not go to the market hall. Instead, she turned toward the pub. Callum Ray was already inside, though the sign on the door still read, "Closed." Light spilled through the frosted windows, and Elspeth could hear the low clink of bottles being moved, the scrape of a chair leg. Callum was the sort of man who needed motion when his thoughts grew too loud. She entered without knocking. Callum looked up sharply, then relaxed into something like relief. "You've a talent for timing," he said. "I was just opening up." "For whom?" Elspeth asked mildly. "For anyone who needs it," he replied. "After yesterday, that's everyone." She sat at the small table near the fire, folding her hands in her lap. "Agnes used to sit there," she said, nodding toward the corner seat by the window. "She liked to see who came in." Callum's mouth tightened. "She liked a lot of things." "She liked leverage," Elspeth said, "and she liked tea." Callum froze for just a moment, then busied himself with wiping the counter. "Everyone likes tea. Not everyone poisons it," Elspeth replied. The cloth stilled in his hand. He did not turn around. "Careful," he said quietly. "Words like that stick." "So does guilt," Elspeth said. "Especially when it's been waiting a long time." Callum faced her then, eyes wary. "You think I did it?" "I think you knew Agnes was dangerous," Elspeth said. "And I think you knew exactly what she'd found." Callum let out a humourless laugh. "Agnes found lots of things. She found something about Mary MacLeod," Elspeth continued. "Something that would have ruined someone who mattered." Callum's jaw clenched. "Mary made her choices. And someone helped her live with them," Elspeth said. "Someone with influence. Someone whose reputation mattered more than the truth." Callum poured himself a coffee he did not drink. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know Agnes visited Mrs. Ainsley," Elspeth said calmly. "I know records were altered. I know you went to the back of the market hall yesterday instead of the front. And I know poison requires privacy." Silence settled between them, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Callum spoke. "Agnes was going to destroy this village," he said. "She didn't care who she hurt as long as she felt important." "She was going to tell the truth," Elspeth said. "She was going to tell her version of it," Callum snapped. "And that matters." Elspeth studied him. "Mary MacLeod was young," she said. "She left the village. She came back with a child and a husband who wasn't the father. Someone made that possible. Callum closed his eyes. It was supposed to be buried. Buried secrets don't stay buried, Elspeth said. They'd leach. Callum's shoulders sagged. I didn't mean for her to die. The words landed softly but irrevocably. Elspeth did not move. Then tell me what you meant. He rubbed his face with both hands. She came to me weeks ago. Said she had proof. Said she'd reveal it at the market where everyone would hear. I begged her not to. I offered money. She laughed. And yesterday? Elspeth asked. She was already worked up, Callum said. Said Fiona deserved to know. Said the village deserved to know. I told her she was playing with fire. And you brought the poison, Elspeth said gently. Callum shook his head violently. No. I brought something to scare her. Laxatives. Something harmless. I wanted her sick enough to miss her moment. That's all. Elspeth felt a chill deeper than the frost outside. And someone else used the opportunity you created, Callum's eyes filled. I left. Her tea unattended. I went to the back to calm myself. When I came back, she was already wrong. Who else knew? Elspeth asked. Callum hesitated. Agnes told Fiona, and she told me she had already spoken to someone else. Someone from the council. Mrs. Grant. The umbrella. Elspeth stood. You need to tell Inspector Fraser everything, she said. Now. They'll arrest me, Callum said dully. They may, Elspeth replied, but they'll also stop looking in the wrong direction. As Elspeth left the pub, the village was beginning to wake in earnest. Doors opened. Curtains twitched. News spread faster than frost melting. She walked straight to the council office, a squat building near the green. Mrs. Grant sat at her desk, posture perfect, expression carefully neutral. Mrs. Grant, Elspeth said, Agnes spoke to you. Mrs. Grant smiled thinly. Agnes spoke to everyone. She threatened you, Elspeth said, with proof. The smile faltered. I don't know what you mean. You know exactly what I mean, Elspeth said, and the poison in Agnes's tea wasn't meant to kill. Someone panicked. Mrs. Grant rose abruptly. You have no authority. The door opened behind Elspeth, and Inspector Fraser stepped inside, eyes sharp, presence immediate. But I do, Fraser said. Mrs. Grant's composure collapsed in an instant. Elspeth stepped aside, letting the truth finally catch up to those who had tried to outrun it. Mrs. Grant did not sit down again. She remained standing behind her desk, fingers pressed flat against the polished surface, as if anchoring herself to it. The neat rows of files behind her, colour-coded and labelled in her tidy hand, suddenly looked less like order and more like concealment. Inspector Fraser closed the door quietly. The sound was soft, but it carried weight. Let's start simply, Fraser said. You knew Agnes MacLeod had documents, records that contradicted the official version of events surrounding Mary MacLeod's past. Mrs. Grant's chin lifted. Agnes misinterpreted what she found. She believed it was enough to destroy someone, Fraser replied. Belief matters. Mrs. Grant's eyes flicked to Elspeth, sharp with resentment. You've been filling her head. Elspeth said nothing. Silence, in moments like this, was more unsettling than denial. Fraser stepped closer. Agnes came to you because the council was involved in altering those records. That requires authority. Yours, specifically. Mrs. Grant exhaled, slow and deliberate. Mary MacLeod was a frightened young woman, she said. She made a mistake. The man involved was married, prominent. His ruin would have destroyed more lives than hers alone. So you chose for everyone, Fraser said evenly. I protected the village, Mrs. Grant snapped. That's my job. Elspeth watched the way Mrs. Grant spoke of protection, the way others spoke of pruning, necessary, decisive, and best done quietly. And Agnes, Fraser asked. Why kill her? Mrs. Grant stiffened. I didn't kill her. You knew Callum Ray interfered with her tea, Fraser said. You knew she'd be alone. You knew panic was already in the room. Mrs. Grant's composure cracked then, a thin fissure spreading fast. I only meant to stop her, she whispered. She wouldn't listen. She said she'd tell Fiona everything. She said she'd stand in the market hall and say his name. And that frightened you, Fraser said. It would have ruined him, Mrs. Grant said fiercely. He has grandchildren, a wife who stood by him for 40 years. And Fiona? Elspeth asked quietly. What about her? Mrs. Grant flinched. Fiona would have survived. People always do. Elspeth felt something cold settle in her chest. Surviving is not the same as being spared. Mrs. Grant closed her eyes. I used something stronger than I intended, she said. I didn't measure it properly, I panicked. She laughed at me. She drank it anyway. Fraser nodded once, as if confirming a calculation she had already made. You'll come with me, she said, quietly. Mrs. Grant's shoulders slumped. Years of careful authority drained away in an instant, leaving behind a woman suddenly very small. As Fraser led her out, Elspeth followed at a respectful distance. Outside, the green had begun to fill again. People sensed movement before they understood meaning. Faces turned. Whispers started. Jamie Sutherland straightened when he saw them, eyes widening. Fraser spoke to him briefly, low and precise. Jamie nodded, colour draining from his face as the reality of the arrest settled in. Mrs. Grant did not look at the crowd as she was guided past. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead, jaw set, dignity clutched tightly to the end. The village reacted in fragments, a sharp intake of breath here, a muttered, I always thought, there. Someone crossed themselves. Someone else shook their head, already reshaping the story to fit their comfort. Elspeth stood still and let it wash over her. Later, when the green had thinned and the police vehicles were gone, Fraser approached her. Her expression was tired now, the sharp edges worn down by consequence. You were right, Fraser said, about the tea, about the back lane, about motive. Elspeth inclined her head slightly. Agnes was careless with her power. She was reckless, Fraser corrected, but she wasn't wrong. No, Elspeth said. She just didn't live long enough to be careful. Fraser studied her. You could have come to me sooner. I needed to be sure, Elspeth replied, and so did you. The corner of Fraser's mouth twitched, conceding the point. Callum Ray will still answer for his part, she said, interfering with evidence, attempted, poisoning. He already knows, Elspeth said. And Fiona? Fraser asked. Elspeth looked toward the notice board, where Fiona stood alone, arms wrapped around herself, watching villagers look at her differently now, not with suspicion, but with something close to pity. She's lost her aunt, Elspeth said, and gained a truth she didn't ask for. That's a heavy exchange. Fraser nodded. We'll speak to her gently. Please do, Elspeth said. The village will not. That evening, Elspeth walked home as the sky bruised purple and grey. Smoke rose from chimneys. Supper smells drifted into the road. Ordinary life resumed its shape with surprising speed. Inside her cottage, she sat by the fire and let the warmth soak into her bones. Agnes's voice echoed faintly in her memory, sharp, certain, pleased with herself. Elspeth wondered, not for the first time, whether Agnes had known how it would end, whether some part of her had understood that secrets exposed so publicly often fought back. Outside, the river moved on, carrying nothing of the village's grief or guilt. By morning, Kilmuir by the Brae would begin the slow work of forgetting, sanding the sharpest edges off the truth until it could be lived with. Elspeth knew better. Some stories never truly ended, they simply waited for the next quiet moment to surface again. The arrest did not bring peace to Kilmuir by the Brae. It brought a pause, which was not the same thing at all. In the days that followed, the village moved as if under glass. People spoke more softly, laughed less readily, and watched one another with a care that bordered on suspicion. Mrs. Grant's office remained closed, its blinds drawn, the council notice pinned crookedly to the door like an afterthought. Callum Ray opened the pub only in the evenings now, and even then the fire burned lower than usual, conversations hushed into careful fragments. Elspeth felt the change most keenly in the way people looked at her. Gratitude, wariness, curiosity. It flickered across faces and vanished again, leaving behind politeness stretched too thin. She accepted it without comment. Villages forgave outcomes more easily than methods. Fiona did not come to the cottage again. Instead, Elspeth saw her from a distance, walking the long way around the green, avoiding familiar paths. Once, Elspeth watched her stop at the notice board and stare at the fading poster from the holiday market, fingers brushing the paper without touching it, as though memory itself might sting. Elspeth waited. When Fiona finally came, it was not with tears or panic, but with a quiet resolve that sat awkwardly on her youth. She stood at the door longer than necessary, gathering herself, then knocked once. I don't want sympathy, Fiona said as soon as she was inside. I get enough of that from people who didn't like Agnes but think they ought to pretend now that she's gone. Elspeth poured tea anyway. Then don't accept it. Fiona wrapped her hands around the cup. They told me everything, she said. About my mother, about the record, about the man. And how do you feel? Elspeth asked. Fiona stared into the tea as if it might cloud over. Angry, she said. Relieved. Ashamed for being relieved. And furious with Agnes for choosing spectacle over kindness. Elspeth nodded. Agnes never understood the difference. Fiona looked up sharply. She didn't have to do it that way. She could have told me privately. She wanted to be seen telling it, Elspeth said. That was always part of it. Fiona exhaled. The inspector gave me Agnes's handbag, or what was left of it. Said there were personal things that weren't evidence anymore. Elspeth's eyes sharpened. And? There was something else, Fiona said. A letter. Not the one they talked about. Not the signed one. Elspeth did not move. What sort of letter? One Agnes wrote herself, Fiona said. No address. Just thoughts, I suppose. She hesitated. She knew she might die. That was new. Fiona reached into her coat and placed the folded paper on the table between them. Elspeth did not touch it at once. Paper held intention, and Agnes's intentions had been sharp. She wrote that if anything happened to her, Fiona continued, it wouldn't be because of the lie everyone thought mattered. She wrote that there was another truth, older and far more dangerous. Elspeth unfolded the letter slowly. Agnes's handwriting marched across the page, neat and confident, every word pressed hard enough to leave faint impressions beneath. If you are reading this, it means they panicked. It means they thought they could silence me the way they silenced her. But this is bigger than Mary. Bigger than shame and reputation. Follow the money. Always follow the money. Elspeth felt the quiet shift again. Subtle but unmistakable. What money? Fiona asked. I don't understand. Elspeth read the final lines twice before answering. Agnes believed there was more than one secret being protected, she said, and that the most dangerous one was never spoken aloud. Fiona's voice trembled. Do you think she was wrong? No, Elspeth said softly. I think she was impatient. They sat in silence, the fire ticking as it settled. Over the next days, Elspeth paid closer attention. Not to conversations, that was too obvious, but to absences, who no longer attended the morning shop queue, who avoided eye contact, who suddenly found reasons to visit Inverness. She noticed, too, that the council accounts, temporarily overseen by a visiting administrator, were late being posted publicly. That was unusual. Mrs. Grant had been meticulous about such things. One afternoon, Elspeth walked past the council office and saw a man she did not recognise unlocking the door. He wore a city coat, the sort that did not expect rain to come sideways. He glanced at her with polite disinterest, already categorising her as harmless. Harmlessness had always been Elspeth's greatest asset. That evening, Jamie Sutherland came by again, less formal this time, his cap left in his hand. Inspector Fraser's gone back north, he said. Paperwork now, statements, sorting. And you? Elspeth asked. I stay, Jamie said. Someone has to. He shifted, uncertain. There's talk, he added, about Agnes, about why she'd dig so deep after all these years. Elspeth looked at him. People rarely change their habits late in life. They just find better reasons to use them. Jamie nodded slowly. They found irregularities, he said. Old ones, council grants, repairs that never happened, payments signed off without much scrutiny. Elspeth thought of the letter. Follow the money. Does Inspector Fraser know? She asked. She will, Jamie said. Soon. Elspeth felt the familiar weight settle again, heavier this time. Agnes had not been killed for gossip. Gossip had merely been the distraction. The real danger lay beneath it, buried under years of small compromises that had grown into something unspeakable. Later, as darkness gathered, Elspeth stood at her window and watched the lights come on across the village. Kilmuir by the Brae looked as it always had. Peaceful, contained, deceptively whole. Agnes MacLeod had cracked the surface and paid for it with her life. Mrs. Grant had acted to protect one truth and exposed another, and somewhere within the village's careful accounts and polite signatures, something older and colder waited to be uncovered. Elspeth folded Agnes's letter and placed it carefully in a drawer. Not everything needed to be said at once. Truth, like winter, worked best when it arrived in stages. Outside, the river continued its patient course, carrying away nothing and everything all at once. The administrator arrived on a Tuesday, which struck Elspeth as deliberate. Tuesdays in Kilmuir by the Bray were quiet by design. The post arrived late, the shop closed early, and most people retreated indoors once the light began to thin. If someone wished to move unnoticed, Tuesday offered the best chance. Agnes would have appreciated the irony. Elspeth watched from her window as the man from the council office returned, this time accompanied by 2 others. One carried a narrow briefcase, the other held nothing at all, which Elspeth found more telling. They entered the office and drew the blinds without ceremony. By mid-afternoon, the pub was already murmuring. Callum stood behind the counter, slower now, his confidence dulled by consequence. He did not speak much, but he listened. Listening, Elspeth had learned, was where the truth usually stumbled. "They're tearing through the old books," someone whispered. "About time. Should have happened years ago. Hush, walls have ears." Elspeth sat with her tea untouched, gaze lowered, absorbing the shape of the talk rather than its offering. People spoke of grants meant for road repairs that never came, of a community hall roof patched twice on paper and never in fact, of invoices approved by people long retired or long dead. The village was remembering selectively, each memory sharpened now by hindsight. She left before dusk, choosing the long way home again. At the bend by the river she paused. Fresh tyre tracks marred the frost near the council building, deep and purposeful. Someone had left in a hurry. That evening Jamie came to her cottage unannounced, breathless, cheeks flushed with cold and urgency. "They found more," he said before she could offer him a chair. "A lot more." Elspeth waited. "Funds diverted," Jamie continued. "Over years, small amounts, never enough to alarm anyone, but steady, always approved by the same 3 signatures. Mrs. Grant. 2 others, all pillars of the village, all safe now only by age or infirmity." "And Agnes?" Elspeth asked. Jamie swallowed. "She found it. That's what the letter meant. She didn't just stumble onto Mary's secret, she used it to pry open the books. She followed the money," Elspeth said. Jamie nodded. She was going to expose it all. At the market, in front of everyone, names, figures, everything. "And that," Elspeth said quietly, "is why Mrs. Grant panicked." Jamie hesitated. "Inspector Fraser thinks Mrs. Grant believed Mary's story was the threat, but that was just the key, not the door." Elspeth felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Agnes had known how to provoke fear, but she had underestimated its reach. When people stole money, they rarely did it alone, and they rarely stopped at one lie. "They'll widen the investigation," Jamie said. "Outside auditors, possibly charges." "And the village?" Elspeth asked. Jamie gave a tired half smile. "The village will pretend it never knew." He left soon after, shoulders hunched against a burden far heavier than his uniform. Elspeth watched until his footsteps faded. That night she dreamed of Agnes for the first time. Agnes stood in the market hall, handbag clutched tight, smiling as people gathered. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The hall filled anyway, not with voices but with water, rising slowly until it lapped at everyone's ankles. Agnes never moved. She only smiled wider. Elspeth woke before the water reached her knees. By morning, the first official notices appeared. An inquiry, a temporary suspension of council activities, a request for patience and cooperation. The words were careful, bloodless. They said nothing of betrayal or fear. Fiona came again that afternoon, quieter than before. "They told me Agnes had become unpredictable," she said, voice flat, "that she was unwell." Elspeth looked. At her. "And do you believe that?" "No," Fiona said. "I think she finally decided she didn't care who hated her anymore." Elspeth nodded. "That can look like madness to people who benefit from silence." Fiona sat heavily. They asked if she'd ever mentioned money. "And had she?" Elspeth asked. Fiona shook her head. Not directly, but she complained about the council constantly, said they were thieves with clean hands. Elspeth smiled faintly. Agnes had a gift for accuracy. Fiona stared at the floor. "They're going to dig up everything," she said. "My family's name too." "Yes," Elspeth said gently. "But this time, it won't be alone." Fiona exhaled, a sound halfway between fear and relief. "I don't know if I'm ready to live here anymore." "You don't have to decide now," Elspeth said. Villagers have long memories. They also have short ones. Both can be exhausting. Fiona stood, hesitated, then leaned forward and hugged Elspeth tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing her clearly, even at the end." After she left, Elspeth walked to the river and stood watching the current slide darkly past. The water carried leaves, twigs, the occasional fragment of something unrecognisable. It never stopped to explain what it took. Agnes MacLeod would be remembered in pieces, as a nuisance, as a victim, as a troublemaker who went too far. Very few would say she was brave. Elspeth knew better. Agnes had lived loudly and died for something she believed mattered more than comfort. That did not make her kind. It did make her dangerous to the right people. As the sky darkened again, Elspeth turned back toward the village. There were still 2 chapters left in this story, whether Kilmuir wished to acknowledge them or not. Truth had a way of insisting on completion, especially once it had tasted air, and the money, once followed, never stopped leading somewhere else. The inquiry began quietly, which was how everyone involved preferred it. No banners appeared on the green, no official vans lingered long enough to draw comment. Instead, letters arrived. Cream envelopes, formal wording, requesting time, records, cooperation. People carried them home as if they were fragile, as if opening them too quickly might release something poisonous. Elspeth received none. That too told her something. She learned of developments the way she always did, sideways. A remark dropped in the shop queue, a pause where conversation should have flowed, the sudden absence of familiar names from casual talk. When people stopped saying a name aloud, it usually meant it had been written down somewhere official. The council office remained closed, blinds permanently drawn now. A temporary notice had been pinned to the door, curling at the edges despite the cold. Administrative review, limited access, please be patient. Patience, Elspeth thought, was easiest to request when you had never been asked for it yourself. One afternoon she found Jamie standing by the river, staring at the water as if it might offer guidance. He looked older than he had a week before. "They've widened it," he said without preamble. "Accounts going back 25 years. "That far?" Elspeth asked. He nodded. It wasn't just Mrs. Grant, she was careful, but others before her were comfortable. Comfort bred assumption. Assumption bred neglect. "And the money?" Elspeth asked. Jamie exhaled. "Moved through community projects, repairs, grants, all plausible, all signed off." He hesitated. Some of it ended up in places no one's ready to admit. Elspeth did not press him. There were truths that belonged to official reports, and truths that could only survive if spoken gently. "They asked about Agnes," Jamie continued, "about when she started asking questions." "She always asked questions," Elspeth said. "She only started being answered recently." Jamie glanced at her. "She threatened to go to the papers." "That would have ended everything," Elspeth said. "Exposure without control terrifies people who've lived on quiet certainty." Jamie's mouth tightened. "Mrs. Grant said she thought she was protecting the village." "She was protecting a version of it," Elspeth replied. "One that benefited her." Jamie skipped a stone into the river. It sank without ceremony. "They're calling Agnes a whistleblower now," he said. "Some of them. Others still say she brought it on herself." Elspeth watched the ripples fade. "Both can be true," she said, "and neither will comfort the dead." The village responded in its own fractured way. Some people grew indignant, loudly insisting they'd always suspected wrongdoing. Others retreated, wounded by the idea that trust, carefully given over decades, had been misplaced. The oldest residents took it hardest. Institutions to them were meant to outlast individuals. To discover rot at the centre felt like a personal betrayal. Fiona packed quietly. Elspeth noticed the boxes only when they appeared by the door of her aunt's old cottage. No announcement, no farewell gathering, just the slow dismantling of a life. They walked together one last time, down to the river path where frost still clung stubbornly to the shaded ground. "I can't stay," Fiona said, voice steady but tight. "Everywhere I go, someone looks at me like I'm a question." Elspeth nodded. "Villagers are bad at letting people become something new." "They'll remember me as Agnes's niece," Fiona continued, "as the girl at the centre of it." "You were never at the centre," Elspeth said. "You were simply nearest the spark." Fiona stopped walking. "Do you think Agnes knew she'd die?" Elspeth considered it carefully. "I think she knew it was possible," she said. and I think she decided that wasn't reason enough to stop. Fiona's eyes filled, though her voice did not break. She was cruel, she said, but she was also tired. Tired of watching people smile while taking what wasn't theirs. Yes, Elspeth said. She mistook cruelty for courage sometimes, but not this time. They stood together, the river moving past without interest. I don't know who I am now, Fiona admitted. That's not a failure, Elspeth said gently. It's an opening. The day Fiona left, the village barely noticed. A car drove away, a door closed. Life, eager to resume its rhythm, filled the silence quickly. The first arrests followed soon after. Not dramatic, but decisive. Former council members summoned, accounts frozen, statements issued with language carefully scrubbed of emotion, responsibility diffused, guilt shared thinly enough to be bearable. Mrs. Grant remained silent. Elspeth wondered whether silence for her was finally a punishment rather than a tool. One evening, Inspector Fraser returned briefly to collect final statements. She found Elspeth at home, the fire low, the kettle already singing. "You were right," Fraser said after a moment, "about the scale of it." Elspeth poured tea. "Agnes didn't die for gossip," she said. "She died because she refused to stop asking where the money went." Fraser nodded. She underestimated how many people that implicated. "People rarely count beyond themselves," Elspeth said. Fraser stood, preparing to leave. "The case will close soon, officially." "And unofficially?" Elspeth asked. Fraser's expression tightened. "Unfinished things have a way of resurfacing." After she left, Elspeth sat alone, listening to the fire settle. The village outside was quieter than usual, as if exhausted by its own revelations. Agnes MacLeod's name would fade. It would soften, become safer. A cautionary tale, perhaps. A troublemaker who went too far. But Elspeth knew what would endure. The records could be corrected, the money traced, the guilty named. What could not be repaired was the certainty people once had, that the structures around them were solid simply because they had always been there. As night deepened, Elspeth closed the curtains and allowed herself a rare, fragile sense of completion. One chapter remained. Not the loud one, the quiet one that followed, when consequences settled into lives and the village learned, slowly, reluctantly, to live with the truth Agnes had died to expose. Now, generate the final section of the story, ensuring a satisfying resolution. Maintain the logical progression of clues and character arcs, delivering the final reveal smoothly while keeping the ending impactful and true to the detective's style. Winter loosened its grip on Kilmuir by the brace slowly, as if reluctant to let go of a village that suited its temperament so well. Frost still lingered in the shaded corners, but the days stretched a little longer, and with the lengthening light came an uncomfortable clarity. What had been uncovered could not be folded away again. The inquiry concluded without ceremony. No public gathering, no speeches on the green. Findings were issued in restrained language, names released in measured order, funds misappropriated over decades, trust abused by those tasked to protect it. A system maintained not by one villain, but by many small, convenient silences. Mrs. Grant's actions were named plainly at last, stripped of justification. Others followed, some living quietly in shame, others already beyond the reach of consequence. Justice, like the river, did not move backward to correct everything it passed. Agnes MacLeod's death was formally recorded as homicide, the poison identified, the chain of events laid out with care. There was no doubt left about who had delivered the final act, nor why. But motive, in the end, sprawled wider than any single name. Agnes had not died because she threatened one's secret. She had died because she threatened an arrangement. Elspeth read the report once, then placed it neatly in the drawer where Agnes's letter had rested. There was nothing more she needed from paper. Life resumed, because it always did. The shop reopened its earlier hours. The pub grew louder again, though never quite as carefree. The council office welcomed new faces, unfamiliar and deliberately distant, their authority grounded not in shared history but in careful procedure. People adjusted, some with relief, others with bitterness that never found a safe place to land. Elspeth noticed how conversations changed. Gossip did not disappear, it never would, but it softened. There was less appetite for sharpness now, as if the village had learned. Briefly, the cost of cruelty sharpened into certainty. One morning, she walked to the market hall alone. The banner from the holiday fair had been taken down at last. The hall stood empty, echoing faintly with her footsteps. She paused at the back door, resting her hand against the cool stone. Nothing marked the spot where Agnes had died. No plaque, no flowers. Memory here was allowed to fade quietly. That was how Agnes would have wanted it least. Elspeth smiled faintly at the thought. Jamie Sutherland stopped her on the green later that day. He looked steadier now, shoulders more certain beneath his uniform. "I've been offered a transfer," he said. "Inverness." "And will you take it?" Elspeth asked. He hesitated. "I think I should. If I stay, I'll always be the lad who was here when it all fell apart." Elspeth nodded. "Leaving doesn't mean abandoning what you learned." Jamie smiled. "You taught me that." She raised an eyebrow. "I taught you very little." "You taught me to listen," he replied, "and to notice who's comfortable when they shouldn't be." He left a week later. The village marked his departure with polite good wishes and quiet relief. Change was easier when it moved away. Spring crept in gradually. Fiona wrote once, then again, her letters cautious but lighter each time. She had found work elsewhere, a place where no one knew her name or her history. She did not ask Elspeth to visit. Some beginnings required distance. Callum Ray sold the pub before summer arrived. He left without fuss, his absence filling the space he once occupied with a dull echo. The pub reopened under new ownership, brighter paint, different music. People said it felt the same. Elspeth knew better. And Agnes MacLeod? Her name surfaced now and then, usually softened, trimmed of its sharper edges. Some remembered her as a nuisance, others as a victim. A few, very few, spoke of her with something close to respect. Elspeth never corrected anyone. Agnes had never needed help being remembered. One evening, as the light lingered longer than the shadows, Elspeth walked to the river again. The water ran high with melt, swift and purposeful. She thought of the money Agnes had followed, of the records she had pried open, of the lie that had merely been the beginning rather than the end. Agnes had understood something most people did not, that truth was rarely singular. It came layered, inconvenient, often arriving in the wrong order. She had chosen to pull at the loudest thread, trusting it would unravel everything else. She had been right. Elspeth stood there until the chill crept back into her bones. She felt no triumph, only a quiet settling. Mysteries did not end with neat bows. They ended when nothing more could be done without causing fresh harm. That night she took Agnes's letter from the drawer one last time and read it again. Follow the money. Always follow the money. Elspeth folded it carefully, then fed it to the fire. The words curled, blackened, vanished. Some truths did not need preserving once they had done their work. Outside, Kilmuir by the Brae slept peacefully, wrapped once more in the illusion of quiet normality. It would carry on. Villagers always did. But beneath the stone and habit something had shifted. A hairline fracture, invisible to most, running through the places where certainty once lived. Elspeth extinguished the lamp and climbed the stairs, her steps unhurried. She did not consider herself a detective and never had. She was simply someone who paid attention when others chose not to, and in the end that had been enough.